I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Well, we're talking today with Dr. Ralina Joseph, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and an adjunct associate professor in the Department of American Ethnic Studies and Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. And this will be our second time talking with her on the program. But today we want to talk about her new book just recently released called Transcending Blackness, From the New Millennium Mulatta to the Exceptional Multiracial on Duke University Press. So one, thank you for writing the book, and two, thank you for joining us. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
The first thing I just want to start with is let's unpack the title, if you would. Let's just start there. What do you mean by transcending blackness from the new millennium mulatta to the exceptional multiracial?
Well, I like all authors, I really struggled with the title for a long time. Um, I really wanted to somehow capture what I thought of as the really kind of troubling trend towards the desire to transcend blackness, to somehow get past, get beyond, move over, and move through these controlling negative notions of blackness. So I knew that that was what I was going towards in the title and the argument that I wanted to make, but at the same time, I was afraid of titling it that because of the thought that somehow transcending blackness would be then thought of as this positive thing, right? This way out for multiracial African Americans. So I had a long title at some point that said Transcending Blackness, Anti-Black Racism, from the New Millennium Mulatta to the Exceptional Multiracial, and the press thought that was too long, and it probably was. But what I'm trying to get at is in this two-sided stereotype of the 21st century rollout of the tragic mulatto figure that I'm calling the New Millennium Mulatta, and then the flip side of it, the idea of the multiracial figure who can somehow rise above the so-called confines of blackness in order to achieve success, the exceptional multiracial, that this transcending blackness metaphor is really kind of looms large in these representations.
So I don't want to skip too far ahead because I know this is sort of where you conclude, but just to start with sort of your conclusion, we are not in a post-racial moment. We are not over these things, as some would say. These issues of race and multiraciality are still worthy of investigation and maybe concern in terms of how they're deployed, at least, in the society. How is that more or less how you would like it to be characterized, or what you're trying to deal with or struggle with?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that these controlling ideas of blackness or anti-black racism are really the specter that looms large over representations of mixed race blackness, like so many other representations of blackness in our culture. And in fact, the discourse of the post-racial, as I try and argue, is ends up being kind of a bait and switch mechanism, so that we think that that's what we're achieving through these much heralded celebrations of multiraciality, and yet it's really kind of falling back on these old school anti-black racist notions.
We talked about this the last time we spoke, but I wanted to return to something that you've already touched on already. I think they're, and I think you deal with them as joined concepts that were ideas. One is that this continuing specific anti-blackness, as opposed to just racism or even just white supremacy, and then the mixed race or multiracial African American, as opposed to again biracial or mixed race or other terms, mulatto and mulatta, which I want to definitely come back to. But specifically, if you could deal with those two initially, this question or this idea of anti-blackness specifically, and then the multiracial African American. Why are these important concepts for you?
Yeah, I think that the anti-blackness or the anti-black racism was really important for me to try and illustrate in these representations, because it is really a controlling idea in our culture that we're not allowed to talk about. That we're allowed to talk in very veiled terms about racism in general, and we're not really allowed to talk about anti-black racism. And so I really wanted for that specificity and to link to that history to be in throughout every page of this book. In terms of the why this kind of weird, clunky term, mixed race African American, I was looking for specificity. I think that these representations that I'm looking at, it's not an accident that they are black-white representations. They're representations that are bringing together symbolically the still kind of gaping racial wound in this country. And so it wasn't just about mixed race as a nebulous category, but it was really about mixed race blackness or mixed race African Americanness.
And also, as I appreciate it, that it is a way of distinguishing the different kinds of experiences, or the different ways, the differing ways people are multiracial. That not everybody, particularly within the context of this country's history with race, have it the same, more or less. And that there is a specific, I think, experience, obviously, of having a black and white parent. That I think that I, at least personally, obviously appreciated in your approach here. Any response to that before I move on, or is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think that I think that it's really important in this kind of growing field of critical mixed race studies, of which I definitely placed my book, that we have a wide variety of critiques and representation of all different forms of mixed race. But I still do think that, for me at least, this story that had not completely been told was about mixed race blackness and black white mixed race in particular.
So again, of the many things that I want to get to, if there are things that I don't mention that you want us to get to, just steer us there. But for a moment, I want to start with the beginning of your book, or go back to the beginning of your book for well, for me, it was it was a great read, but also very it was personally engaging for a number of different reasons. And one of them, just from the beginning, the first time I was asked to write about my experience being as you say, a mixed race African American or multiracial African American, the first thing I said was what you deal with here was this question, as you call it, the ubiquitous question of what are you. And as a sort of foundational question. And so I wanted you, if you could start there and talk about, as you do at the beginning of your book, what the autumn of 1992 meant for you, your entering Brown's campus, and this question of what are you, that, as you explained, brought you to where you are today with your study of these issues.
Yeah, so I start off the book with this kind of personal reflection in order to talk about what my stakes are in this issue. And yes, 20 years ago, when I began college, at that time, as you know, the idea of having kind of a multiracial identity was really a nascent idea, that this was not something that people were talking about or identifying as. And so, although growing up in the DC area, I knew plenty of people who were mixed race, as my family was, having that as kind of a term and a self-identification was not available to me. And it became available through college, because that was what was happening on college campuses at the time. And I was used to answering the questions, what are you, throughout my childhood and early adolescence. But I didn't have a single term as an answer. And so for me, multiracial became that term through all of the things that I learned through this beginning budding multiracial student movement. And that was a really wonderful and exciting thing for me. And I threw myself into that movement, and then I soon became disillusioned with it, because I think that I started to understand that what I didn't want to do was then to make multiracial into a more special thing, to isolate it as as an experience that somehow was unique to, or what was seemed like it was posited as better than other racialized experiences,
Right.
but instead to look at it within populations, other populations of color, within other minoritized populations. So that was very much where the book grew out of. And I think that while the landscape of race and mixed race has changed on college campuses, I think that there's some version of this that goes on for so many multiracial students that I still meet today, even 20 years later, having access to the term, but still trying to figure out exactly which of the terms am I going to use to identify myself today. Is it okay for me to use a different one tomorrow? What about my parents? How are they going to feel? Am I going to slight one of my parents if I don't name both of them? All these same issues are the ones that mixed race folks are often dealing with. And now as having two young children that I'm helping them to think through as well.
Yeah. Another time, I would like to revisit the specific question of parenting, kind of like parenting while multiracial or whatever, because I mean it's deep, and a lot of things do change, and then you have to, like, or at least for me, you have to revisit some things you thought you didn't have to revisit anymore. It's been very interesting. I'd like to at some point talk with you about that. Um, I forgot you grew up out here. I forgot that. I'm glad you reminded me of that point, because I grew up, was born in D.C., but grew up in Maryland,
Uh-huh.
and my mother's in Columbia, Maryland, in particular, where the whole multiracial thing was sort of romanticized, but my mother always liked the term biracial. She always wanted to call me biracial, and I hated that. From the earliest that I can remember, I've always hated that term, and I never really fully understood why. And I'm still, I think, trying to figure out how to verbalize it, which is another reason why I like so much of what you've done here. Because as you write here, I just want to read very quickly, it was the evolving definition of identity or self-definition. You said Justice Stewart Hall became black in Jamaica in the 1960s with the advent of black nationalism in the United States. I became multiracial in New England of the 1990s with the advent of the multiracial student movement on my liberal college campus. I was privately mixed for the first 17 years of my life until I publicly came out as multiracial. And in many ways, I felt the same way, except I've never really liked even the term to this day, multiracial, as a for political reasons. That I was I'm a black man with a white mother,
Right.
which is so I'm which is kind of where I wanted to segue a little bit, because you talked
Uh-huh.
also about a lot about the role, what all this means in terms of power relationships, white power in particular. But one thing that you talked about was the political origins of the heightened concern in this country over a multiracial identity.
Right.
And could you talk a little bit about that shift and your interaction with that shift?
Yeah. Yeah. So at that moment in the mid 1990s, as this multiracial movement was growing across the country, and Kim Williams, the political scientist, documents this beautifully in her book, Check One or More. What we found was that these multiracial movements that were growing were not actually, as one might think, populated by mixed race people or even mixed race youth, but instead by interracial couples, primarily white women married to African American men. And the white women were the ones who really kind of took charge and led this movement all the way to the creation of this check one or more category on the census. And it was my sense in talking to people and reading and seeing people's reaction to me that the desire for a mixed race category, and this might have to do with your own hesitation about identifying with any type of that word, was really about identifying against blackness, right? Or this idea of transcending blackness. And so I wanted to very much kind of name that in the book. And since I look at popular culture, that there's no way that popular culture can be divorced from this idea. And in fact, I think it very much shows these notions that we have these characters who are either really damned by their drops of blackness, just like the old tragic mulatto character. Even as they understand that this is an old controlling trope, they still can't move beyond it. Or they figured out somehow how to metaphorically slough off their blackness, and then that's how they achieve success. But I think that these kind of anti-black racist notions, for me, were evident, just as Kim Williams writes about, from the very early stages of the multiracial movement. And that's why I also, have had a really mixed, pun intended, relationship to multiracial studies. But I think that as critical multiracial studies is coming to be, that there are a lot of us who are now writing on the topic and are somehow, we can't get away. We're interested in it, we're intrigued by it, we're named by it. And yet we also have issues and problems. We want to make sure that that Black communities are not further dismissed and demeaned and denigrated by multiracialism.
Yeah, no, that was exactly it, and without even thinking of it, I mean, just as a kid, I remember I always go back to this that very early on, some white kid said to me, very matter of factly, "You're a nigger, but not like the other niggers."
Mm-hmm.
And it was meant to be like,
a compliment.
Yeah, and even as a kid, I was like, I don't like. Wait a minute, I'm not. I'm not. I mean, I'm offended by that.
Yes. Yes.
Which is why so much again, and I don't mean to stay here too long, but so much about your own personal experience in your the preface or the introduction resonated with me. I mean, just going back very briefly, at least, when you talk about the meetings with BOMS, the Brown Organization of multi and biracial student organization, and the arguments or the debates in there about you talk about in your newsletter, or in one of the early newsletters, that there was a statement about always having to choose sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a note that I always felt compelled to choose sides, and eventually went, some would laughingly say I've continued to go too far, but with this whole Black and African identity, like just completely running. But in a way that what I appreciate how Dream Hampton put it when she said that me calling myself a feminist is no more dismissal of my male father than me calling myself a Black woman is meant to dismiss my white mother. Yeah. It's that kind of, which I still think is a brilliant point. But that, and I mean, so there was that you talked about, and then the shift within BOMS. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. How that sort of shift occurred, and then just very quickly, you mentioned Lisa Jones, the daughter of at the time Leroy Jones and Hetty Jones, now Mary Baraka. But we just read as a family Hetty Jones's biography. And I had never read it until this year. Uh-huh. But at the end, she quotes Lisa, and then I'm going to stop here and let you, please stop me. But you just get all this in here real quick. That she quotes Lisa as saying something that, I mean, you have a quote in here talking about Lisa responding to this question of being racially ambiguous, and what are you? And again, this question that I still get to this day. What are you? But she says she said in the Hetty Jones biography, the myth of the American mulatto as perpetual outsider cast helplessly between two bloodlines, forever conflicted with no allegiances, only denies the authority of Black culture and the empowering sense of Black identity in an American and world community, end quote. And I have always I mean, that speaks very much to me. So I don't know. I don't even know where I'm going to have a question here. But if any of that is something you'd like to respond to or talk more about, please do. Otherwise, I do actually have more questions. But I just wanted to share with you how excited I was to read this. Anyway, I don't know if there was anything in all that you wanted to respond to or embellish.
I think I'm good. But
Okay.
but I love that
Yes.
you all read Hetty Jones's was it her autobiography? Was it How I Became Hetty Jones,
Yeah,
or
that
was
one. I'm
it?
sorry, the autobiography. Right. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because
That's I love that you guys read that as a family. That's great. Did your kids read it too?
no, they're not old enough yet. It was just
Okay.
and then and then my wife is from Panama, so this has we got a whole lot going on here. But my mother and my wife and I read it.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Because my mother, I mean, literally down I mean, my mother's experience was very similar to Hetty's.
Mm.
And I mean, from the Jewish background to the New York background to literally being in some of the exact same spaces and knowing the exact same people. So
Yeah.
it was fascinating. And both our fathers knew each other a little bit and were highly political, within the black movement. So, so there was all these ebbs and it was interesting. It was interesting. Yeah. Anyway, but that Lisa Jones quote, which I had never read before, really it still resonates. I mean, it stuck out, and so as I was reading yours, it reminded me of that, and your reference to her. Anyway, so good. Okay.
Yeah.
So
she was
yeah.
very, very influential for me. I think that at that point, what she was writing in her Village Voice columns was something that we couldn't see in scholarship on mixed race at the time. And so certainly she inspired me to want to go to graduate school and to put a different type of a scholarly voice to the type of personal essays that she was writing.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned a moment ago this never-ending and inescapable trope of the tragic mulatta.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk about the ways you address that in your book, Transcending Blackness, and starting with some of the more popular figures that you talk about. Oh man, her name just escapes me. The star of Mixing Nia.
Parsons,
I'm sorry, you went out for a second. Say that again.
Oh, Karen Parsons.
Karen Parsons, right. And Mariah Carey.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to come to Barack Obama. And I know we said 30 minutes. We're not even getting started. So whatever. But, so if we could start with how you maybe quickly explain what you mean by the tragic mulatta, and a little bit of its history, its historical deployment here. But then start to talk about how you deal with this in terms of popular media or popular consciousness, starting with Mixing Nia.
So the tragic mulatta character is one who we've known for hundreds of years at this point throughout literature as the torn figure who is always damned by her blood, by her black blood, not by her white blood. So it's not. I think that's an important point. It's not just the mixture, but it's the drops of black blood. She is psychologically unstable. She is tempestuous. She is sexually over the top, excessive, and I think that what we see now in terms of representations of mixed race blackness is certainly hits on some of those elements. But what I found in my formulation of the new Millennium Mulatta, that there's also a self-reflexivity, so that there's an acknowledgement of this old trope and an attempt to identify against it. And yet, what I found was that in the novel Caucasia, for example, or Jennifer Beals' character on the television show The L Word, that these characters end up inevitably performing this role. That they're a lot in life almost.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.